Hi, this is Tom, and thank you for joining. Please consider subscribing. This week we continue our build number 4, the SCX10ii Builder's Kit, and we're specifically attaching the front and rear suspensions. So in today's video we'll be attaching those suspension parts that we built a few weeks ago, effectively attaching upper and lower links to the chassis and chassis rails, and installing the shocks. So glad you made it. Sit back, relax, and enjoy another week here on Bryn Mawr RC. It's the front steering servo, and so the first thing we're going to do is install the front suspension that we built quite a few steps ago. And here is the front suspension here. So let's get it the right orientation. Okay. You can see the bottom. Well, it's actually the top, but it's the bottom of the steering, the bottom of the front, and here's the steering servo. So I have to put this there. I'm just going to rest the chassis up here until I figure out where these go. Okay, so here are the two lower links, and I think that's what they have us putting in first. So we have a 15mm screw that sets this lower link into this opening on the transmission skid plate. So let me get that in there. I can't even get the damn thing lined up. Pop in. Okay, so there's one lower link temporarily set into the skid plate of the transmission. Now I want to set the other one. Okay, I temporarily or partially have the two lower links tied into the bottom of the transmission skid plate. These are not fully tightened. I partially have the upper link, this one here, tied into the side rail. I don't have a nut on there yet. And then the last part of this is to actually tie in the front drive shaft to the input gear of the differential on the front axle. And that's where I'm at right now. I just need to tie that down. Okay, that pin screw is now going in nicely. And nice and hand tight. Give it a little test. Looks good. Now the last thing we have to sort out is just this here. Is the lower link. Silly me. Okay. So backing it out a little bit so I can now put the locking nut, the thick locking nut. I don't know how I'm going to do this. I'm going to have to have 5 hands. Okay. See if I can get this to work. Put it right in there. Okay, let's give this a try. Like I marred the hell out of it, but oh well. Hopefully that's tight enough. Okay, I think there it is for step 1 of the front suspension. We have the drive shaft connected to the input gear of the differential. We have the upper arm attached and the 2 lower arms attached. Next step on the front suspension is to actually install the shocks. So we're going to go from the shock tower to this part of the axle, right there, I do believe. The rest of our presentation this week will be performed with pictures of my work and a voiceover. Here we see the front shock hoop and the front suspension as the chassis is suspended up in the air on a block. We'll be adding the shocks here. The shocks that we are adding are the ones that have the yellow springs, at least for now. Here you see the front shock partially attached to the shock hoop and then down to the axle. And here's attachment to the shock hoop. Next is the steering linkage, and recall the steering arm or the steering linkage was already attached to the front axle, and now the other part will be attached to the steering servo. I don't have a picture of me attaching the steering servo, but you can see it here in this next picture. It is an SSD metal servo horn that I purchased rather than having the plastic. Now, rear suspension. The next portion here are pictures of my work attaching the rear suspension. Here we see the chassis upside down resting on the shock hoops. Again, this is the rear part of the chassis. The chassis is upside down resting on the shock hoops. And here we see the 2 lower arms of the rear suspension being tied into the skid plate of the transmission. And you can see where those 2 arms are attached. Here's actually attaching right now. Another view of the attachment. And now here, rear is much simpler than the front. Recall the rear suspension just has 4 links, 2 upper, 2 lower. The front has all that mechanism for steering. So those were the attachment of the 4 links in the rear, and here are the attachment of the white spring shocks. And just a close-up of the shock being attached to the shock hoop. We're complete for this week. Thank you so much for joining. Stay safe, be well, and come back again next week for our next video on Bryn Mawr RC. Thanks. Bye.